Good morning. Our study this morning is in the 65th chapter of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 65. Ned, if your voice will stand it, would you word a prayer for us?
Yes, I'll do short. Yes, sir. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this beautiful Lord's Day that we have. We can come and have fellowship with one another. Pray, Lord, be with all the teachers this morning as they teach, that we can learn and apply it to our lives. Be with those who choose not to be here today. Be with those who are sick, that there'll be a portion of their health restored that they'll return to us. Continue to bless us, watch over us, forgive us of our sins. Be with our nation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Are you leading singing this morning? Ned's having a little voice problem today. Chapter 65. The history of the Jewish nation is very interesting. It's very interesting the perceptions that Jewish people have with regard to their relationship with God. I recall as a kid living south of Youngstown on the farm, and there would be sometimes people come out from Youngstown or in the urban area there and buy things, potatoes and so forth. And I well remember this Jewish person, announcing in our driveway that, the Jews are God's chosen people. Now, he was very, my perception of his conversation was he was very proud of being, of Jewish descent, and it was very, let people know that he was among the chosen. Well, the State Fair this year, there was a Messianic Jew booth. Any of you visit that? Any of you went to the State Fair, visit their booth? Well, I stopped by to visit this fella who said that he was among the Jews who, accepted the Savior, the Messiah. And I said, we talked a little while and went back to the booth, and after I talked to him, and I got some of our literature, and I took it back to his booth. I'd picked up some of his stuff, and I took it back to his booth, and he said, well, I don't want that. I don't want that. I said, well, I took some of your stuff. I don't want it. I'm not looking for a church. I'm a Messianic Jew. Now, think about that. I'm not looking for a church. What did Jesus say he was going to build? Matthew 16:18. Now, build my church. Now, how are you Messianic and yet not be looking for the church? It's just kind of a phenomenal philosophy that folks have. Now, the Jews, as described in Isaiah 65 and 66, the last two chapters of Isaiah, and throughout the book of Isaiah, were very proud, I guess you'd say, that they were God's chosen people. And they were God's chosen people regardless of how they behaved, right? That was kind of the attitude that they had. They were God's people regardless of their behavior, their worship. And when you think about it, and we get into that kind of a description of all this in chapters 65 and 66, as we have in previous chapters, they mixed the law of Moses with about everything. They worshipped. Let's go back to Solomon when he had all those wives. He set up worship services to what kinds of idols? Pagan idols. What were some specific idols that he? Moloch, Baal, sun worship, worship of the stars. I mean, he had a section of Jerusalem where he had all this stuff set up. Well, the Jews from time to time, they were Baal worshipers. They worshipped the stars. They worshipped this and that. But they were God's chosen people in their minds, right? It's very fascinating to think about how the Jewish mentality through the years. Now, chapters 65 and 66, the last two chapters of the scripture here, or the Isaiah prophecy, he deals with a variety of subjects that he'd dealt with before. Some of the themes that he deals with in those last two chapters, he had already covered, but reiterates some. In chapter 65, we have in the first few verses there, the first 7 verses or so, God's reply to the complaint registered in the prayer for deliverance in a previous chapter. He deals in this first in this chapter with the destruction of the he deals with the destruction of the wrongdoers, the evildoers, and the redemption of the remnant, the faithful. He deals with threats to the unfaithful and promise to the faithful, again, that theme. And then he also deals with a glorious picture and description of the age of the Messiah. The last, from the verse 17 on, in physical terms, he describes the church age, the new covenant age. And so let's just dive into chapter 65, verse 1. I am sought of them that asketh not for me. I am found of them that sought me not. I said, behold me, unto a nation that was not called by my name. Now what's that sound like he's talking about there? He's talking about the Gentile world. I am sought of them that ask me not for me. When just in thinking about history now, when did the Gentiles start seeking God in earnest? Was it during the period of intertestament, that space between the Jews returning to Jerusalem from Babylonian captivity in the first century? Did the Gentile world start seeking God at that point? During that period of time, that span of time? No evidence of it, no historical evidence of it. And so it was during that New Testament period of time that obviously that the Gentiles, and isn't it really ironic as you think about this, that here for century after century, God dealt delicately sometimes sometimes forcefully, with this Jewish nation. I mean, isn't it interesting that, he took Jacob and his family and nurtured them and coddled them and begged them and punished them to come back to him. And when the Messiah finally came, there were a few of them that accepted the Messiah. A few in terms of percentage of the population. But then the Gentiles took to the gospel a lot more readily than the Gentiles took the gospel a lot more readily than the Jews. Doesn't that seem strange? I mean, it seems ironic to me that's the way it turned out, and that's the prophet kind of alludes to that. Verse 2, he goes back to the Jews here. I've spread out my hands all the day into a rebellious people. Picture in your mind God spreading out his hands to this rebellious nation. What figure does that conjure up in your mind? Pardon me? Well, that has maybe a secondary reference, but here's God spreading out his hands. Well, what's the imagery we get there? What's the message? Pardon me? Yeah. It's here's the God of the universe spreading out his arms, in a sense, begging them to be faithful, right? Is that what that?
But seeing the rejection that they gave him. I mean, I just picture his face and like, I'm here, why are you not seeing us?
Yeah.
I'm telling you everything that you're rejecting.
Yeah. The God of the universe. Inviting, pleading, imploring them.
Why? Why did he give them so much chance?
Pardon me?
Why?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know except that God is good. God wants mankind to be saved. He wants to have a relationship with mankind. He wants to have the mankind respect him, worship him.
I understand that, but I'm talking about the Jews specifically.
Huh?
They just kept slapping him in the face.
Yeah.
He made a promise to Abraham. He wasn't going to break his promise to him that through Abraham the world would be saved, basically.
Right. I mean, he obviously kept true to his promise. The promise that through Abraham's seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. He obviously maintained.
The Savior would be coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But let's think that. Let's try to think this in human terms. Let's suppose you've got an invitation to the White House. I don't mean one of those general invitations we get in the mail, for $500, or for $10,000 you can visit with the president. Let's suppose you get an invitation from the White House. Well, would the typical person go? Ned, would you get into your car and you'd go, or probably most people would. That would be quite an honor, wouldn't it? Huh? Okay, I said the typical person. So Nikki, let's suppose during the Clinton years you got an invitation to the White House. Would you go? See? let's suppose you got an invitation to go to some other foreign government as a representative of the United States. And let's suppose you didn't accept the invitation. We've had that happen just recently, haven't we? Right? Let's suppose then, here's a person rejects. I'm not going to go to the White House. I'm not, okay. Then let's suppose that the president, who, regardless, forget about personality now, but the president comes out and begs you, please come, accept my invitation, come to the White House. And you reject that, and the masses reject that. How's that going to make the president feel, or the head of the government feel? Not so good, right? Now, we read over these passages, and it just kind of just slides by. I've spread out my hands all the day unto a rebellious people, which walketh in a way that was not good after their own thoughts. Now, when you think about this, and I don't want to dwell on this too much, but when you think about this, and God, through Moses, led the children of Israel out of Egypt, and when they got to the edge of the Red Sea, what was some of the reaction here? They didn't see much of a way forward, so what was the reaction? Yeah. Moses, we told you to leave us alone. When they got into the wilderness, what was the reaction? Man, we long for those good meals we had back there as slaves. Right. And why God put up with all that, you see, it's a marvel, isn't it? And he's just, I've spread out my hands all the day unto the rebellious people, which walketh in a way that was not good after their own thoughts. Then he continues that. He says, a people that provoketh me to anger continually to my face. What's the idea there? They provoke me continually to my face. It was just as if they were getting up in God's face and rebelling, saying, God, I'm not going to do this, okay? That sacrifices in the gardens and burneth incense upon altars of the brick. Now, what were they doing that was contrary to God? First of all, they sacrificed in the gardens. They burneth incense upon the altars of the brick. Where was the altar to be? In Jerusalem, right? If they had other altars, what did the law of Moses say about the type of altar that it would be? The stone. It would be what? It wouldn't have had tools on it. It'd be shaped. It would have been natural. And they were, these people were just, they were worshiping some of the they were worshiping this god, that god, whatever, on man-made altars, which remaineth among the graves and lodge in the monuments. Now, which remaineth among the graves and lodged in the monuments. Wonder what practice they were doing that is described here. Commentators indicate that sometimes the Jews would sleep in sepulchres. Sometimes these people. Well, let's go back to Saul. He outlawed witches, right? He outlawed that practice of trying to communicate with the dead. How do we know that? Well, Samuel records it. And so there was this practice of trying to communicate with the dead. And it was, then they ate swine's flesh. What's wrong with that? And the broth of the abominable things is in their vessels. What's wrong with the swine's flesh? It was against the law of Moses. Why was it against the law of Moses? There are some theories that, hogs have parasites of certain kind. What is that parasite? Pardon me? I'm sorry? Trichinosis, yeah. But for whatever reason, God outlawed the eating of swine's flesh. Now, they was just kind of like, I'll do it anyway. Just a rebellious, and he's chronicling the things here that were against his law. Now let's think about this in this context. After the Jews came back from Babylonian captivity, did they have any trouble did they get into idol worship and eating swine's flesh and, eating pigs? According to history, I don't think so. In fact, during that period between the Testaments, during the Maccabees period, one of the ruthless rulers tried to force the Jews to eat swine, and even forced sacrifice of swine on the altar. So the Jews got cured of that, due to that Babylonian captivity. In verse 5, which say, stand by thyself, come not near to me, for I am holier than thou. These are a smoke to my nose, a fire that burneth all the day long. That expression, stand by thyself, not come near me, for I am holier than thou. What's the prophet trying to communicate here in terms of what God said? We use that expression, holier than thou, right? We've heard that expression. It describes someone that is, what I guess you'd say pompously, feels like they are so much more spiritual, so much more holy than someone else.
Like a Pharisee.
Yeah, they were kind of the precursors of the Pharisee, the attitude of the Pharisees. Well, the Jews had this attitude, it was going back to that attitude that regardless of what they did, they were always in good standing with God. And what was God's reaction to that kind of attitude? It was like smoke in his nostrils. Now, I suppose all of us have had smoke in our nostrils. Is that right? I'm not talking about smoking. I'm talking about being around a fire or being around smoke. Not a very pleasant experience, right? Well, what's God say? He said, the attitude of you people, not all of you, but the attitude of you people is like smoke in my nostrils continually, all the time, every day, every hour of every day. And it's like smoke in my nose, a fire that burneth all day. Behold, it is written before me, I will not keep silence. Is God going to walk away from this scene and just not say anything or do anything? Well, obviously not. Because the next statement here is that, but I will not keep silent, but will recompense, even recompense into thy bosom. Now, what's the significance of into thy bosom? Into thy bosom. It's not going to be pretty, right? It is not going to be pretty. Like a punch in the gut, we might say. Right? I will recompense, even recompense into thy bosom. We often hear somebody say that, that's like a punch in the gut. Well, what they're trying to say is that wasn't pretty. That wasn't good. That was hurt. That was hurtful. And in verse 7, he continues that. Your iniquities and the iniquities of your father together, saith the Lord, which have burned incense upon the mountains and blasphemy upon the hills, therefore I will measure their former work into their bosom. The rebellious nature of the Jews from the very beginning had just continued to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate until what did God do with the nation? Obviously, they broke the covenant. They broke the covenant. But God's promise that through Abraham's seed would all the nations of the earth be blessed. Fortunately, there was a remnant of those Jewish people. There was a group of those Jewish people through the years that were faithful down to the time of Christ. Now, Kathy mentioned the Pharisees. Were they faithful? No. Were the Sadducees faithful? No, they didn't even believe in the resurrection. Were the Herodians, the party of the Herodians, faithful? Obviously not. Were the Essenes? I don't know anything about the Essenes except it was a very strict group of people that they were kind of like, had their society of their own. They were, off in the distance, so to speak. But the masses of the Jews weren't faithful. But name some people that at the time of Christ seemed to be faithful. Well, the father of John the Baptist was faithful, and his mother Elizabeth was faithful, right? They were faithful. Who else? Mary was faithful. We presume Joseph was faithful. Who else was faithful? Pardon me? In the temple, Anna was there for what, 8 decades, serving, you know. There were a few of those. And then, of course, Jesus had some disciples and 12 apostles, and then 120 that were with him, and they're up to 500 and so on. So, but basically, there was just a few. Your iniquities and iniquities of your fathers together, saith the Lord, which have burned incense upon the mountains and blasphemy upon the hills. Therefore I will measure their former work into their bosom. Now then, in beginning in verse 8, thus saith the Lord, as the new wine is found in the cluster, and one saith, destroy it not, for a blessing is in it, so will I do for my servant's sake, that I may not destroy them all. That expression there, that new wine is found in the cluster, what does that seem to relate to? There will be a few. There will be a remnant. There is a remnant. A few. And that in that poetic language there, as the new wine is found in the cluster, just in a grape arbor, here's a cluster among all the grapes. Destroy it not, for a blessing is in it. So will I do for my servant's sake, that I may not destroy them all. God proposed to Moses, when Moses came down off the mountain and found the children of Israel, worshiping the idol. God proposed to Moses that he'd just destroy that whole bunch, right? And Moses, intervened. He talked on. He was kind of their attorney. Talked on their behalf and said, "No, please don't do this." But God preserved them. And through the years, he's just preserved. A remnant had been preserved through the years down to the time of Christ. And this remnant, this body of people, would be like this cluster of grapes. And God preserved that cluster. And the church of Christ, the church that Christ established, emerged from that. Verse 9, I will bring forth a seed out of Jacob and out of Judah, an inheritor of my mountains, and mine elect shall inherit it, and my servants shall dwell there. What's he talking about there? I'll bring forth a seed out of Jacob. A seed out of Jacob. A seed out of that family that he chose. That seed that was promised to Abraham. Through thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And mine elect shall inherit it, and my servants shall dwell there. Now, he's using very figurative language here, discussing physical things in terms of what the Jews could relate to, the Jews at that time could relate to. And then in verse 10 he says, and Sharon shall be a fold of flocks. He's describing here something, great, something wonderful. This seed out of Jacob. And Sharon shall be a fold of flocks, and the valley of Achor a place for the herds to lie down in, for my people that have sought me. Now, Sharon, that area of that Palestinian area, very productive area, agriculturally speaking. Valley of Achor, very productive. Herds, So what he was projecting here, describing as an entity in the future, is going to be very wholesome, productive, a very great thing. And then in verse 11, he says, but. Now that word but, why what does that put forth? Conditional. But, well, and however, well, but ye are they that forsake the Lord and forget my holy mountain, and prepare a table for that troop, and that furnish the drink offering unto that number. Now, that's kind of strange language there to me. But ye are they that forsake the Lord, that forget my holy mountain, and prepare a table for that troop, and furnish the drink offering unto that number. Now, the English Standard Version renders verse 11 this way, and several other translations render it similarly. He says, but you who forsake the Lord, who forget my holy mountain, who set a table for fortune, and fill cups of mixed wine for destiny. So, the words troop and number are translated in the ESV as fortune and destiny. Now, what's that about? The Jews, following some other people, worshipped Jupiter and Venus. They worshipped the stars, these certain heavenly bodies. Now, in verse 11, he's just continuing this thought of how rebellious these people were, following others in false worship. He said, I mean, it's just amazing what they did. In verse 12, therefore, okay, that word therefore, that signals to our mind something, and that something is that as a result of this, something's going to happen. Therefore, will I number you to the sword, and ye shall all bow down to the slaughter. Because when I called, you did not answer. When I spake, you did not hear, but did evil before mine eyes, and did choose that wherein I delighteth not. So what's God saying here through Isaiah? There's a time of reckoning. There's a punishment that's going to happen. It just amazes me that so many people in the religious world are thinking that contemporarily the Jewish nation, that is, that plot of ground around Jerusalem, that the Jewish nation is somehow a product of prophecy. I mean, it's amazing. The Jewish nation was formed by a group of men. The League of Nations, was it the League of Nations or the United Nations? Who knows their history?
The United Nations. So after World War II,
Yeah.
so it was the United Nations.
1948. So it was the United Nations had come into being. The League of Nations started, and then
The United Nations was one body that formed after World War I that failed. That's why World War II.
okay, well then the United Nations, the group of men formed Israel. God didn't form the nation of Israel. It was a group of men. It was the League of Nations, or it was the United Nations. There's some. It was just amazing that people somehow have the idea that somehow this plot of land where a lot of Jewish people are settled figures into prophecy in terms of what God's going to do with mankind. Just amazing.